The Sony ZV-E10 and the Canon R50 are great cameras for almost anyone from casual shooters to serious creators. But which one is better and right for you? They look similar on paper, but they're actually very different cameras. Each has its pros and cons, and you might be surprised at which one is right for you. So let's do a deep dive into both cameras while comparing them to see which one is right for you. And if you want the best pricing, check out the links down below. So to start things off, let's talk about the most important part of both cameras, the sensor and the processor, and why they're important. The sensor is the main thing responsible for your resolution and image quality. While both cameras have a 24 megapixel APS-C size sensor, they're actually very different sensors. And to the naked eye, they might look pretty similar. But there's a lot of complicated stuff happening underneath the hood, and you start to see some pretty big differences when you do more complicated stuff with these cameras. For example, Sony has specifically designed the sensors in the ZV-E10 and most of their cameras to be really good in low light. So the ZV-E10 is clean in photos up to 10,000 ISO, and even as high as 4,000, 5,000 ISO for video, it's a very, very clean image. So the Sony ZV-E10 is already way better at low light than the R50. The R50 does have a low light mode, but it's not quite as good as the ZV-E10. However, Canon is known for having spectacular colors. All the colors from Canon cameras are very warm, true to life, and they especially make skin tones and faces look really good. And when you put a Canon R50 next to the ZV-E10, I personally find the skin tones on the Canon look a lot better. But that's not the end of it, because chances are you're also going to be editing your photos and videos, so it's not quite a cut and clear winner yet. However, that's where the processor comes in, because each camera has a different processor that allows the camera to do different things with the sensor and how it actually captures that image. For example, the Canon R50 actually has AI-based autofocus thanks to that processor. With AI-based autofocus, the camera can actually intelligently recognize if it's looking at people, animals, cars, and will intelligently track subject matter because it already has data from an AI model inside the camera, so it knows exactly what it's looking at and already knows exactly how the subject's going to move and where it's going to go. Now, with the ZV-10, you have an older processor, so while the autofocus in the ZV-10 is phenomenal, it's not AI-based autofocus. However, Sony is pretty much the king of autofocus in the camera game right now, and despite the autofocus in the ZV-10 not being AI-based, it's pretty much just set it and forget it. It does a really great job with tracking subjects even if they're moving fast, and the ZV-10 does have face and eye detect, so when it comes to shooting people, the two cameras should perform pretty much on par. However, one really cool feature that both cameras have is known as product showcase. This is where you can simply hold up a product to the camera, and the camera will intelligently snap focus to the product, and when you put it back down, it'll snap back to your face. This is a really useful feature for someone that's maybe talking about products on screen, or if you're a tech YouTuber like me. And both cameras also have touch autofocus, but because of the newer processor and just overall better implementation of touch autofocus, I think the R50 is much more user-friendly. Both cameras have really good autofocus, especially for casual users. You can use it to vlog, casually shoot travel and adventure, and if you want, you can even make YouTube videos with these cameras. The autofocus will not let you down. But thanks to that processor, when it comes to actually shooting photos and videos, there's a pretty big difference on how these cameras perform. The Canon R50 can shoot anywhere between 12 to 15 frames per second in photo mode, and the ZV-E10 goes slightly slower at 11 frames per second. And in my opinion, you're probably not going to notice those few extra frames. And both cameras would be really good for capturing action, fast-moving subject matter, if you're on vacation, if you're shooting sports, maybe wildlife if you're out there in the woods with this camera, but you're going to have a really easy time just capturing action with both cameras. Now, it might seem like the R50 is better because it shoots slightly faster. However, the R50 can only shoot anywhere between 28 to 42 JPEGs in a row, which is just like the format you want if you're a casual shooter. However, when it comes to shooting raw photos on the R50, it can only shoot 7 raw photos in a row. So if you're someone that likes to edit your photos and really make something professional looking or just creative, you're going to have a pretty hard time shooting fast-paced action if you're shooting raw. However, the ZV-10 shooting at full 11 frames per second can actually record up to 116 JPEGs in a row, which is way better for casual shooters and is way better than the Canon R50. Now, on top of that, if you're planning on shooting a lot of raw photos and because you want to edit your photos, the ZV-10 can also record 46 raw photos in a row before it needs a break. This is going to be way better for someone that wants to do long bursts of raw shooting, and if you want to be able to take your photos and edit them later on, and you're shooting a lot of action, the ZV-10 is already going to be a much better camera for you. But when you compare just raw Canon photos and raw Sony photos, in my testing, I actually find that the Sonys have a little bit more dynamic range and they're more flexible in their raw format. The Canon cameras still do a very good job, but I find the Canon cameras are not quite as easy to bring up the shadows as the Sony cameras are. But that's not a surprise because the ZV-10 is much better in low lights. However, that's just photos. We still have to talk about video, and that's going to make a huge difference for you guys. Both cameras shoot 4K at 24 and 30 frames per second, and the video is also downsampled from a 6K image resolution, which means your 4K video files really have the detail and clarity of a 6K video file, but it's smaller and you still have a more manageable 4K video file. Both cameras would be really good for vloggers, YouTube creators, casual shooters, on vacation, lifestyle shooting. Both cameras are going to give you really solid 4K that's absolutely going to blow your phone out of the water. And both cameras record 60 frames per second for 2x slow motion and 120 frames per second for 5x slow motion. And the full HD looks really good on both cameras. Now, most casual shooters think they don't need to care about colors because they're never going to be editing their colors. But chances are, if you make a video clip, you might want to adjust the color temperature, maybe just tweak it a little bit to make it look good for you, because it's hard to get exactly the look you want in camera. And both of these cameras do allow you to edit your colors pretty significantly, but they both have a very different way of getting there. In standard mode, the R50 gives you 8-bit color, but again, you have those gorgeous Canon colors right in camera. However, you also have HDR PQ mode, which gives you 10-bit color for greater color flexibility, and you also have HDR in this mode, which gives you more dynamic range. Now, when it comes to the ZV-10, it only shoots in 8-bit color. There is no 10-bit in this camera, but it gives you way more options when it comes to color profiles, which means you can set this camera up in S-Log2, S-Log3, HGL, and there's a bunch of different options that you can use to set your camera up for the exact shooting environment that you're working in. This way, you're going to be able to get this camera to look exactly how you want, even without 10-bit color. However, I will say you have so many options in the ZV-10 that for beginners and casual users, it's just going to be overwhelming. You're going to need input LUTs to get it to where you want it, and you're going to need editing software. So for beginners and casuals, the R50 is going to be much simpler, much more streamlined. The ZV-10 is definitely something for power users and people that are serious about their video color. Now, chances are you probably like one camera over the other simply based on specs, but specs are not the end of the world, and you could get a really powerful camera with amazing specs, but if it's not designed and built for what you're specifically shooting, chances are you're going to struggle using that camera and it's just not going to be a pleasant experience. But on top of that, you also have to consider what lenses you can use for this camera, because Canon has some pretty anti-consumer policies in their cameras that might make it that you end up spending a lot more money on Canon lenses than you would on Sony lenses. And lenses determine exactly how sharp and how good your image looks, because that's exactly what brings all the light in to the sensor. So you want to make sure you're using not only the right lenses, but also you want the most amount of flexibility to be able to use any kind of lens you want for your shooting style. Now, when we look at the Canon R50, it looks like a pretty typical photo video camera. It has a small compact body with a side articulating screen that is also touch enabled with phenomenal touch autofocus. Chances are if you pick up this camera and it's one of your first cameras, you're going to have a really easy time getting the hang of it. It's a really easy camera to just pick up and get great results with. On top of that, it also has an electronic viewfinder, which has a surprisingly high refresh rate and high resolution for a budget entry-level camera like this. And photographers are really going to love this viewfinder. The Canon R50 also has something known as intelligent auto mode. In this mode, you simply tell the camera what you want in terms of brightness, contrast, color values, even how much background blur you want, and the camera will make all of the complicated settings for you. This is great for beginners because it's going to take a lot of the guesswork out of your shooting. And the R50 also has built-in microphones, although they're not very good, but you do have the option of plugging in an external microphone and headphone jack. But when you look at the ZV-10, it has a very sleek and modern design, but it's still a small and compact camera. However, the first thing that you'll notice, it doesn't have a mode dial. Instead, it only has one switch to go between photo, video, and slow motion, so there's no complicated, messy mode dial, which in my opinion does make this camera a lot better to use. The ZV-10 also has a side-articulating touchscreen with touch autofocus, but the touch capabilities are way better on the R50, and if you're someone that's really into touch autofocus, I do think the R50 is a better buy. But one thing to note is that the ZV-10 does not have an electronic viewfinder, which means you cannot put this camera up to your eye for taking photos. You have to rely on the LCD screen, which some photographers that I know absolutely hate doing that. So it's going to depend on how you like to shoot. However, one place that the ZV-10 absolutely rocks is the built-in microphone. It actually has a 3-capsule microphone built right in, so while the audio isn't quite as good as like a professional lav mic or professional shotgun mic, it is still very, very good, and you almost don't need to buy an external microphone. Not only is this going to save you anywhere between $100 to $200, but if you're a vlogger, this is going to allow you to shoot with this camera in a much smaller form factor without having to add an additional bulky microphone. And of course, you still have an input for an external microphone and headphones, but Sony has also recently put out brand new on-camera microphones that will work with the ZV-10, and those are really good microphones, so it might be worth getting the ZV-10 just to use the Sony audio. Now, one thing that people often forget to consider when picking up these cameras is how hot do they get, because when recording video, both cameras do get hot and eventually they will shut down from overheating. In my experience, the ZV-10 can run for a lot longer. You can go for 40 minutes to maybe an hour and a half, depending on how hot your room is. With the R50, pretty much after 20 minutes, an overheating symbol will come up on your screen, and at about 40 minutes, your camera will shut down for overheating. So if you're planning on using video record mode for an extended period of time, the R50 is maybe not the best bet for you. It's probably better for someone that's recording short clips. Earlier I said that one of the most important things to consider when it comes to your camera are the lenses. With the Canon R50, you can only use the Canon RF lenses, which only Canon makes, so they can set whatever price they want for these lenses, whether they're good or not. With Sony cameras, you can use Sony lenses, third-party lenses, even like really cheap $50 to $100 Chinese lenses off Amazon. Now, that's not to say that Canon doesn't have good lenses for this camera. You do have some really affordable zoom lenses, and you do have some really affordable primes for this camera that range anywhere between $200 to maybe $500 on the top end. When it comes to beginner lenses for both of these cameras, I do think Sony simply has a better selection than Canon right now. And when the Canon RF line first launched, a lot of people complained about how there just weren't enough lenses that people actually wanted to use for this system, so that's something to keep in mind. So at the end of the day, when you look at the specs and design of each camera and you compare them, which camera is right for you specifically for what you're planning on shooting? If you're a casual shooter, the R50 is going to give you fast photos, very snappy JPEG, great autofocus, and really great 4K video. And with HDR-PQ mode, you're also going to get quite a bit of flexibility to edit your videos exactly how you want them to look. But if you're a power user, for someone that's maybe an online content creator, a YouTuber, or vlogger, ZV-E10 is going to give you way more flexibility. It's going to give you way more options. And it's also going to allow you to set up your camera exactly how you want it. But on top of that, the ZV-10 can also shoot photos for longer before needing a break. It can also record video for longer before needing a break. And I really love the fact that it has that internal built-in microphone that's going to give you phenomenal audio. And the Sony microphones that they've been making for these cameras are also really good. And those microphones alone might be worth getting the ZV-10. So depending on what camera you choose, make sure you get the right one based on your needs. And if you want to make sure you get the best possible pricing on your camera, make sure to check out the links in the description down below, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.